think there's like a malicious, officer twirling his mustache going, haha, how do I, get away with this? Well, I've never seen any evidence of that person. Exactly right. I think that there's just a lot of status quoism, like I said, and people just don't know that there are better ways to do things.
This is Climate Curious, the podcast for people who are bored, scared, or confused by climate change.
I'm Maryam, Pasha, the director and curator at TEDxLondon and the co-host of this podcast, alongside the amazing Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Hurst, activist and advocate exploring what positive masculinities can look like, and self-confessed climate normie.
Welcome back to another episode from Climate Week NYC. Hi, Ben.
Hi, everyone.
So today, Ben, we're going to start with a pop quiz.
Okay.
And like every pop quiz, you didn't know it was coming.
Let's go. I'm ready. I'm a professional.
4 seasons in, I want to ask you, what are greenhouse gases?
What are they?
Yeah, well, can you name me some greenhouse gases?
Yeah.
Can you do it not like theoretically?
Yes. Carbon.
Okay.
Is carbon a gas? Carbon. Methane.
Yes.
Hydrogen. Oxygen. Hydrogen.
I mean, they're
methane.
Not... Methane, you're right.
Yep.
Hydrogen and oxygen are gases, but they're not greenhouse gases. But it's okay, you can stop
nitrogen.
There. No, the nitrogen makes up a greenhouse gas, but not as a... Okay, we're going to stop. We're going to stop before Ben leaves, because luckily we have someone who actually can answer that question and a lot more, because we're not going to just talk about greenhouse gases today. I want to welcome our guest today, Lekha Sridhar. She is the Senior Policy Analyst at What Time, which is a clean energy nonprofit based in California, and manages international partnerships for Climate Trace. We're going to explain what all of that means. Before working in this world, she was at the UN Environmental Programme and has worked with the government of India on policy around sustainable cooling, and was an environmental litigation attorney in India, which is pretty cool. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with some basics, right? What are greenhouse gases?
Please.
What are greenhouse gas emissions? Let's start there.
Greenhouse gases are what trap heat in our atmosphere, and that's what's causing climate change.
So essentially what I said.
Yes. You got the methane bit right. So we have carbon dioxide, which is the most abundant greenhouse gas, stays in the atmosphere forever unless it's sequestered, absorbed by trees or other sources. And then you have methane or methane, as we say in the US, and nitrous oxide, which don't stay in the atmosphere forever. They're called short-lived climate pollutants, but they have so much more warming potential than carbon dioxide, which means they trap more heat than carbon dioxide does. So in the short time that they're around, they do so much more damage. So fixing all of these is the goal.
What's the difference in the amount of time? Forever versus
20 to 30 years, depending on the gas. Yeah.
But does more damage in the 20 to 30 years.
Yeah, exactly right. So, for example, nitrous oxide has something like over 200 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide, which means it traps 200 times the heat.
That doesn't sound good.
It does not.
Sounds bad.
Okay, another basic question before we get into it. So these are the gases. What emits them? Like what kinds of things, activities?
Yeah, pretty much everything emits greenhouse gases. But of course, the biggest source of carbon emissions are energy production. Cars, our power plants, heavy industries producing steel and cement, but also other things like agriculture. We've all heard that, beef cattle are a big source of methane or methane. And, when we destroy our forests, we're also emitting carbon. So pretty much all our modern activities have carbon impact. Fixing all of these is the goal.
Yeah, okay. So
this is not a good,
hopefully
situation, is it?
Hopefully if you're hearing this for the first time, you're going to keep listening to this podcast. I want to ask a little bit about how, because data is really important, right? Mm-hmm. In this equation. So tell me a little bit about kind of your work and what you do and the measurement of these greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, I mean, this measuring greenhouse gases is how we know. I mean, all the countries came together to agree to the Paris Agreement. Mm-hmm. And how do we know if the Paris Agreement is actually working? So, which is why transparency in emissions is kind of the backbone of the Paris Agreement. Countries report their emissions every couple of years, and for some countries it's every year when they're kind of like the high-income countries. So that is the centerpiece of the Paris Agreement. That's how we know that, countries are doing what they said that they would do, which is reduce emissions or, not reducing emissions.
This is my second climate conference now, right? And both times, there's been a lot of conversation about transparency.
Yeah.
Is this because people are lying? Are people just a quite blunt question, but are there people who are telling porkies or something?
Well, that's the thing, right? In a lot of cases, we don't know.
Okay.
Because how you measure greenhouse gases is such a dense and opaque area that I didn't know about, even though I'd been working in the climate space until I started working on this project.
Right.
Okay, so tell us up until historically, how have we measured?
So here's the thing, right? You want to think about at what scale are we talking about measuring? If you're thinking about how's the planet doing in reducing greenhouse gases, we have these satellites. They are great at telling us these, 415 parts per million is the carbon dioxide, and, it's now 416, whatever it is. So we know as a planet how we're doing when it comes to emissions. But when it comes to an individual plant, a single power plant in your neighborhood, or you're lucky enough not to live near a power plant, I should say. In a lot of cases, we don't actually know. So the gold standard for knowing what emissions are from a single source are actual sensors, similar to the ones that are up in space measuring a planet's emissions. You can have one right at your power plant or your facility. Those are great. Those give you 24/7, 365 days of the year. They give you what the emissions are. Problem is, only a fraction of the facilities around the world actually have one of those. And as you probably guessed, they tend to be, concentrated in a few specific countries.
Right.
So how are all the other power plants doing? How are all the other steel plants doing? How are all the farms doing? Data tends to be patchy, really fragmented, and relies a lot on things like, last year we burned 10 tons of coal. So, assuming based on physics, we think that this is how much the emissions are.
Right.
That's how most of emissions measurement works. And that's how all the countries and a lot of companies, subnational governments, that is to say state governments or city governments, are actually measuring emissions. It's all done on an Excel sheet.
So we have a good global picture, but a bad local national picture.
Exactly.
Which means that we can't. Does that mean that we can't find out who's doing it?
I mean, this.
I'm all about
analogy.
catching the culprit. I'm like, where are you?
The analogy that comes to mind is it's like asking someone, tell us about how much you ate over the last week. And they're like, a couple of salads and maybe just one burger. Right. And meanwhile, it's Deliveroo every night.
Yeah.
Exactly right. But it isn't just about catching the bad guy. It's also about helping the good guys do a better job. If a city knew where its emissions were coming from, they'd be like, great, now we can put in a policy to fix, buildings and, switch all our heating to electric heating or something like that, to heat pumps.
Yep.
So it's really about kind of incentivizing the good guys to do their job. It isn't just about catching the bad guys.
Sorry, everyone
then
who's
goes to the villains.
Yeah.
I want to catch them.
But you know what? Okay, so this is actually, I find this so interesting because I recently reconnected with, I have a favorite statistician. I know, it's a weird thing to have.
We all do.
Mine is Ola Rosling. He's my favorite statistician. I got to speak to him recently, and we were talking about how he does all these things around with Gapminder around accurate pictures of data. And one of the things that he just reminded me again was that if we don't actually know, we can actually be focused and pulled off, and our focus can be in the wrong place, right? So we can have all the good intention of wanting to do something, but if we think it's all the problems are over here, let's say, we'll focus on that, and actually there's a plant down the road that's causing all the issues. Is that part of what the point of thinking about this
That's exactly right. You want to make sure that you're focusing on the right things, that the actions you've taken in the past are actually having the impact you want them to. And also, there are other kind of knock-on effects as well. For example, if you want to get a project financed, you need data. And, no surprise, all of climate finance tends to go to the richer countries that have this, really strong, rich culture of, collecting data. Whereas the countries that really need the financing aren't accessing it. And a part of that reason is lack of data.
So like one part accountability and one part opportunity for innovation. Okay,
love it.
Cool.
Okay, so this is, I just have to say, thank you for explaining something extremely complicated so well.
Yeah, like what are greenhouse gases?
And like how do we measure them and like why? And so then what we're excited to talk to you about is how we're doing it better, right? So tell us how we're doing this better. So you've got the planetary level. Yeah. How are we doing it better on the small
Right.
scale?
So, I mentioned earlier that, you have some places where you have sensors that actually do collect accurate measurements of data. We call that ground truth data. And you'll hear me use that term a few times.
Ground truth data.
That's right.
GTD.
Yes.
That's what the kids are calling it on the streets.
Exactly right. Yeah, it's as close to the objective truth that you can get when it comes to a greenhouse gas measurement. Now, that's only available in a few locations. But what does collect a global picture are satellites. We have so many satellites that have been launched in the recent years, and they're not just collecting emissions data, but they're collecting a lot of imagery. So what we do at Climate Trace, and I'll tell you what Climate Trace means a little bit down the road, we basically use satellite imagery to identify observable signals of emissions. So take a power plant, for example. How do you know if it's on? There's a steam plume coming out of the stack. That's just carbon dioxide and water vapor. If there is a steam plume coming out of the stack and you can see that on an image, then chances are that the power plant is on and therefore generating emissions.
Right.
We're not actually seeing the emissions, but we're seeing a proxy for the emissions, which is the steam plume. So we collect as many images as we can of these power plants, as many locations as possible, and we train our artificial intelligence algorithms on the ground truth data that we have in a few locations and correlate the two of them. So now, for the locations where we do have ground truth data and those images, we now know what the emissions are, and we can use that same model for countries and locations where we have no ground truth data. So now we actually do have a global picture of emissions globally.
So is that like the same thing that you were saying about people who do the calculation of how much coal they burn and therefore approximately this amount of emissions?
Exactly.
Right.
But in this case, we do have one measurable signal, which is that we can see the steam plumes coming out of a power plant.
Okay.
So we do the exact same thing for every single sector. Climate Trace, we're a coalition of tech and climate nonprofits. Each of us have a focus on one emission sector. So, what time the organization I belong to, we focus on power plants. We have Ocean Mind that focuses on shipping, another big source of emissions. Transition Zero, they focus on heavy industries. Again, all big emission sectors, and several others that I don't know that we have done. Heavy industries are steel, cement, aluminum. Yeah, huge emitters. So each of us focus on one of these areas. We apply similar methods. So take, for example, Ocean Mind. They use a technology that wasn't actually made for estimating emissions. I don't know if you know this, but all large ships have a transceiver that's constantly kind of pinging their signal and their location. It's for security reasons.
Like a sonar.
Yeah.
Oh, is it actually like a sonar?
Not a sonar, but it's basically...
You're going to laugh. The reason I know this is when I'm on holiday, I love to sit on the beach and open up a ship tracking device.
No, you do not. No, you don't. Are you telling the truth?
I am, and I look at all the ships that I can see and what they are.
Oh, like the same ones that they use for aeroplanes.
Exactly.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly right. Yes.
Right.
So they use that, and when we have that, we now know if a ship has moved from point A to point B and what speed it moved at. Both of these are really important for measuring emissions. And if we can also have the data on, what the ship engine is, the model and the make, you can have a really good picture of that individual ship's emissions.
So it's like an extreme
like
version of a GCSE maths exam. Yeah, it's really giving me flashbacks.
Moves from this place to this place, and it's this heavy, and it moves this fast. How much greenhouse gas emissions?
That's quite cool, actually.
Yeah.
It is extremely cool. I'm not the engineer, and I'm in awe of all the engineers I work with.
Just take the credit.
That's right, yes.
It is you. You did it
everything single-handedly, just yesterday.
Yeah. What I love is this idea, though, that you're able to use the AI to kind of help you get better, right? Is it an algorithm that also gets smarter the more data comes into it?
Absolutely. And that's the point of this, is that we're really at the starting stage right now. And we've had lots of interest from companies who reached out, and they're like, we want to donate data on like this individual power plant. And we can use that as ground truth data and as training data for our algorithms, constantly improving our algorithm over time. And that, it's just the start, and we'll get better.
So you've solved it, you've fixed it.
Well,
you've done it. It's over. We know the information.
They really want
we've
things
caught
to be
them. We
fixed.
know who they are.
No, we're at the start, and there's still so much more we could do in improving our accuracy, and we could get more. We're definitely getting more granular, which means getting to smaller and smaller units that are emitting emissions. Yeah, but I think we made a really good start. We've got the machinery in place. Just got to keep building on it.
So this is really cool. And I am curious to know, because we talked about governments and the Paris Agreement. I'm curious to know how it's been both received by governments and industry.
Absolutely, yes. I have to say that we've received nothing but positive feedback so far.
Really?
Especially from, I don't know if you've heard this term, non-state actors, which is a wonderfully poetic phrase we use for anyone that isn't a country government that's part of the Paris Agreement.
Okay.
Now,
are those like big businesses?
Big businesses, small cities, just everyone.
Okay. Right,
yes,
right.
like local nonprofit, everyone.
Okay.
All of them are also committing to net zero commitments. You know, you've had like several large companies saying, we're going to go net zero by 2050 or whatever. So all of them are realizing that they've made these commitments, and how are they going to have the data to actually know where their palm oil came from, know where their steel came from, which factory it came from that, they're putting in their cars. And there's immense demand for technologies like these to help people really understand where their emissions are coming from and have an accurate picture of it.
Right. I don't know why the palm oil thing made it so much clearer in my... Just the words palm oil, because then I feel like, once you know where you're getting your stuff from, you can decide, you can make better decisions about who is doing the least damage.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, a lot of large companies, they aren't manufacturing every single part of their supply chain themselves. They're outsourcing some of it, they're procuring some of it. And so they don't necessarily control those processes. They don't own the ships that the goods get transported on. So knowing what the emissions were from the steel plant or the iron mine where the iron was mined, and then the emissions to the steel plant where the steel was manufactured and then transported to, the factory of an automaker. All of those are not necessarily parts that they control, but they need the data on so that they can make decisions.
My assumption is that for countries in particular, people benefit from misrepresentation in terms of data, because that means that they can economically do more. I don't know if that, obviously I don't know what I'm talking about. So if that is wrong, please correct me. But I would have assumed that the response from governments, for example, wouldn't have been a positive. I wouldn't have thought that people would have wanted to be regulated in that way.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say it's all been like, we want to hide our emissions. There's a lot of legacy systems that we're talking about where most of these inventories are prepared by a country's statistical office that sources all of these information from different parts of it. And there's a lot of status quoism where people are just like, well, this is how we've done it. This is what our data says.
Right.
I don't think there's like a malicious, officer twirling his mustache going, haha, how do I, get away with this?
But it'd be great if there was.
I know.
We may be different. No,
yeah, well, I've never seen any evidence of that person. Exactly right. I think that there's just a lot of status quoism, like I said, and people just don't know that there are better ways to do things. And well, that's why we're here to, let people know that, look, there's this new source of data that you can incorporate into your existing inventories, or your inventory, by the way, is what we call a measurement of a country's emissions from every single sector. Yeah, so countries report their emissions, and that's called an inventory of emissions. So just, have this additional source of information for countries. We're not trying to replace what countries are doing. The inventories that they prepare are so valuable for the world. I mean, not just for their own citizens, but just globally, just knowing that, agriculture emissions are actually falling globally or something like that. Knowing that information is so valuable. We don't want to supplant that. We're just saying, here's an additional source of information for you to use and validate what you're doing.
I mean, for me, it's like it becomes so, the idea that knowing if what you're doing is working also seems really important. Like, we keep talking about the decisive decade. We keep talking about these short time frames. It means then that you need to know very quickly if what you're doing is working. You can't wait, and this is something I was going to ask you. Am I right thinking, because I think I've seen this before, that sometimes countries, it takes them years to report their emissions, right? So if we don't have years, is this part of the solution of moving faster?
Absolutely. Last year, I haven't updated the figure yet. We calculated that there were over 100 countries whose inventories were older than 2015. Which is, crazy. Like 2015 was the year when the Paris Agreement was entered into. 100 countries since then had not updated their inventory. And that included huge emitters like India and China.
And there's been like 17 versions of the iPhones.
And mate, that's a lot of emissions.
Yeah. And to be fair, preparing an inventory is time consuming. It is expensive. It's not just two people in a room. You have to source information from every single department of your government, and those departments are sourcing information from all the producers. Some countries just have built these systems for many years, and it's going to take time for all the other countries to kind of get there and kind of build these systems. But you're right. We don't have the time. We need data right now. We need recent data. We need timely data that isn't 5 years old. So people can know, that policy I put in place last year, it's working or it's not working.
So what is the hope? Like, in terms of like now that you have this tool, what's like best case scenario, desired outcome of what people do with it?
Well, the best case scenario would be for everyone to look at this data and be like, great, I'm reducing emissions on the basis of this. Whether it's a country government, whether it's a city or a state government, or companies, to just be able to use this data and make better decisions on where their emissions are coming from and switch to decisions that reduce their emissions. That's the hope.
So what I think is really cool here is that this is like this is part of that bigger systems change of like creating a better world in general, right? Like, so if you care about where your emissions are coming from and you do all three scopes, then you're creating more transparency, which is just good for everything, right? Labor, rights, as well as climate.
Exactly right. And, especially when big companies exert pressure on their supply chains, it has a transformational effect. Because, if they're saying that, well, look, we're only going to ship on the least emitting ships, you bet that everyone else is going to be like, right, great. Okay, how do we clean up our shipping sector? We need like these big buyers to be using us.
What I like really about it actually is because, the companies that have signed up to that now, are, I would say, are leaders, are people who have individuals in positions of power who genuinely care, where it's not just greenwashing, right? So because they didn't have to do it. No one's telling them they have to do it. And I'm curious to know, when you were talking about this new use of data and measurement that you have, is this going to be part of feeding into that and helping those leaders be better at?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in a little more than a month, we're launching the first ever version of our database where we're going to have emissions down to an individual facility, which is an individual mine or an individual plant. And this is exactly what's going to help people know the emissions from their supply chains. If they use bauxite, which is, by the way, used for aluminum manufacture, they will now know what the emissions were. So this is, I think, a big part of helping people just kind of have more transparency into their emissions.
I think it's cool, right? Because that means that when it filters down to us and someone puts like green on something, we also have more confidence that we're not being conned. That actually is something that makes us feel like we're playing our part.
Yeah,
it's not just a sticker.
Who would have thought data is actually important? My gosh. My goodness.
As you probably know, I love geeky data stuff as I track ships on my holiday. But we're bringing Ben over to the data side. Thank you so much for chatting with us about this. We have one last thing.
And now it's time for our climate confessions. Let's fess up to the bad habits we just can't kick.
I have the perfect confession.
Yes. So we always ask people to say, like, look, there are things I'm not doing so well either, but I can still be part of the bigger change. So what is your climate confession?
We bought a car in New York City. In Manhattan.
Oh, the cars are literally not moving in the street. They're stuck for hours.
We bought one been 2 years, and I have to say, I like having a car.
Oh no!
Yes.
I know.
Was it an EV?
No.
Oh my gosh!
Double confession.
This is terrible.
And
This
I
is.
think it's an SUV.
Oh, I'm judging you really intensely. You're worse than me.
I know.
No, Ben.
No.
That's not possible.
So that's my confession.
I love it. That's good. I mean, we are also big fans of cars, Ben and I.
Yeah.
So yeah, but you know what is actually one of the things in the US, right, is the charging infrastructure isn't there yet. And so and especially if you live in the cities, what are you supposed to do? Like throw a charging cable out your like 5th story
Window,
balcony.
yeah.
You know, so I think there's
That's a really good
I'm
point.
hoping that with all the new money that's coming into it, we'll have this conversation in 2 years and I'll be like, yeah, I have an EV. It's super
You know, lots of states are doing really well. Lots of states have been kind of funding charging infrastructure. I have to say, lots of my colleagues have EVs and they love it. So I should be clear that I don't actually drive. It's my husband who does. So.
She's like, my climate confession is my husband.
This is your scope 3 emissions through your family.
100%. I mean, I get driven around.
Okay,
So
I'm the same. I don't drive, but I get driven around.
We benefit from
We
it.
benefit
So-
from it. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for joining us today. This has been
this was so fun. Thank
fun,
you.
so clear. I feel
Yeah.
like I can explain it now, which is amazing.
Great.
Stay curious. Thank you for joining us this week. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
If you did, please hit the follow button to make sure you get next week's release.
We are now officially crowdsourcing Climate Confession, so please leave yours in the ratings and the reviews section, and we'll shout out for you next time. And shout out to our fabulous team behind the pod.
This episode was produced by Josie Colter,
Comms written by Tess Lowry,
artwork designed by Rebecca Mingus,
curation by Maryam Pasha,
mixed and engineered by Ben Beheshti,
music also by Ben Beheshti,
presented by Ben Hurst.
and Maryam Pasha. Remember, stay curious.